The millionaire's son was blind, and his darkness was filled with a constant fear of everyone and everything. His father, a man who could buy the world, couldn't buy courage for his son. The best doctors had failed. The boy's life seemed destined for a prison of anxiety until a simple housekeeper was hired. No one paid much attention to her. Then, one day, the millionaire came home early and, from the doorway, saw a scene that left him in complete shock. A scene that defied medicine and logic, revealing a secret no one could ever have imagined. Arthur watched the ceaseless flow of green and red numbers dancing across his computer screen. Each digit represented a fraction of his vast empire, a testament to his ability to transform capital into an almost unimaginable fortune. Equities rose, dividends compounded, and his net worth grew with clockwork precision. He was a master of the financial universe, a man who understood the complex language of the capital markets, who navigated Wall Street with the confidence of an admiral in familiar seas. His businesses spanned continents, his portfolio was diversified, and his wealth was an impenetrable fortress. And yet, all it took was a single sound from the hallway for that entire sense of power to dissolve like smoke, revealing the fragile truth of his life. He was utterly powerless. The sound was the soft shuffle of small feet, followed by a heavy, expectant silence. It was his son, Leo, moving through the house like a frightened ghost. On the other side of the massive oak door, Arthur's world was made of logic and profit. On this side, in the heart of his own home, reigned an empire of darkness and fear. Leo had been born blind, a condition modern medicine could not reverse. But the absence of sight was only part of the labyrinth. A profound anxiety enveloped him, an invisible barrier that isolated him from the world, any unfamiliar voice, the unexpected touch of a hand, the sound of a falling object. All were triggers for him to curl into himself, transforming into a small sphere of silent terror. The best specialists, whose fees were as astronomical as the returns on his most profitable investments, had paraded through the Westchester mansion. They came with their theories, their methods, and their empty promises, and they left behind only the echo of their failure. The departure of his wife, years ago, had only deepened the chasm between father and son, leaving them adrift in a cold, solitary opulence. Now, the house, with its immaculate corridors and staff who moved with the discretion of shadows, seemed to mock him, a monument to his most personal failure. It was on a particularly grey day that Mrs. Albright, the housekeeper who ran the home with the efficiency of a drill sergeant, approached him with palpable reluctance. Her methods were traditional, built on silence and order, and she saw any deviation as an affront. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice as formal as ever, "I have exhausted my list of contacts. There is one last recommendation, though it is unorthodox, a young woman, for cleaning the children's wing. Her name is Clara." The hesitation in her voice was a bad omen, but Arthur's desperation was greater than his suspicion. He nodded, a gesture of surrender. Anything was better than the suffocating silence that had become the soundtrack of their lives. And so, Clara arrived. She didn't enter like the others, with her head bowed and her eyes fixed on the marble floor. She carried a quiet warmth, a smile that wasn't forced and seemed to light up her eyes. As Mrs. Albright gave her instructions in a curt tone, Clara just listened, nodding, her presence a soft note amidst the house's rigidity. Later, hidden by the half-open door of his study, Arthur heard her start to work in the hallway. She wasn't loud, but she wasn't silent either. A low, melodious hum escaped her lips, a wordless lullaby. And then, something extraordinary happened. Leo, who spent his days locked in his room, a sanctuary against the outside world, appeared at his door. He didn't come out, just stood there in the threshold, his head tilted toward that soft, unfamiliar sound. He wasn't cowering. For the first time in a very, very long time, his small body was not tense with fear, but taut with curiosity. The next morning, the house seemed to hold its breath. Arthur, from his polished desk that reflected the high ceiling like a dark mirror, felt like an investor before the opening bell on the NYSE, a mix of anxiety and calculated expectation. He had built his empire on predictability, on algorithms and risk analysis, but here, in his own home, was a variable he couldn't quantify: Clara. All his wealth, his assets spread across the globe, seemed useless against the silence of his son. What was money compared to the wall that isolated him from Leo? He heard Clara's soft footsteps approaching down the hall, followed by the quiet sound of the children's wing door opening. He allowed himself to peek, a billionaire hiding in his own fortress, observing a scene none of his financial analysts could ever decipher. Clara didn't enter Leo's room. Instead, she began cleaning the hallway, and her voice floated into the air, as soft as the dust she was removing from the furniture. "Good morning, long hallway," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Today, we're going to make this wood floor shine. I'm going to use a soft cloth that glides with almost no noise, like a little boat on the water." Mrs. Albright appeared at the other end of the hall, her face a mask of disapproval. She marched to Arthur's study, her rigid posture a silent declaration of war. "Sir," she said, her voice low but charged with urgency, "this is unacceptable. She is disturbing the boy's peace. He requires absolute silence. Talking to oneself is a sign of instability. All my work to create a calm environment is being undone." Arthur looked at the housekeeper, a woman who had served his family with unquestionable loyalty, but who saw the world in black and white, in rules and protocols. He thought of his riskiest investments, the ones that defied market logic, but had yielded the greatest returns. Perhaps this too required a high-risk investment. "Leave her be, Agnes." For now, the housekeeper withdrew, but her disapproval lingered in the air, as thick as the humidity before a storm. Arthur turned his attention back to the hallway. Clara was now cleaning the large glass panels that overlooked the garden. "Look at that," she hummed. "The sun is trying to come in, but the glass is a little foggy. I'll clean it, and then the sunbeams can come inside and warm up the floor. The sun's warmth on your skin feels like a warm hug." The door to Leo's room opened a little wider. The boy was there, a small silhouette in the dim light, his head turned toward the voice. He didn't flinch, he didn't retreat, he just listened, his body still, but his mind, Arthur could feel, was stretching out, reaching into the darkness toward that voice that painted the world with words. For the first week, it was always like this. Clara never addressed Leo directly. She narrated her work, describing the colors of the flowers she replaced, the scent of the lavender-scented cleaning products, the texture of the linen she folded. And Leo gradually began to leave his door open, first a crack, then a hand's width, until finally he would sit on the floor, just inside his room but facing the hall, a silent audience to a world being narrated to him for the first time. On Friday, Arthur was watching the scene repeat itself when something different happened. Clara was polishing a small bronze statue of a horse on the hall table. "This little metal horse is cold," she said, her voice a little louder. "But if I rub it hard, the cloth makes it warm and shiny. The sound the cloth makes is a soft swish, swish." She rubbed the bronze, producing the very sibilant sound she had described. Across the hall, Leo, who was sitting on the threshold of his doorway, slowly raised his hand. The gesture was hesitant, trembling. He didn't point, didn't try to reach, just held his hand up in the air toward the sound, his small fingers opening and closing as if trying to grasp the sound vibration itself. At that exact moment, Mrs. Albright appeared behind him. "See!" she exclaimed, her voice a whip crack in the silence. "She is frightening him. I told you this woman and her strange methods would upset him." Mrs. Albright's shout cut through the air like a shard of glass. The effect was immediate and devastating. Leo's small hand, which had been hovering in the air like a curious butterfly, dropped instantly. His body contracted and, with an agility born of panic, he scrambled backward, disappearing through his bedroom door. The soft click of the lock sounded in the hallway with the finality of a vault being sealed. The fragile thread of connection, so carefully woven throughout the week, had snapped. Clara remained motionless for a moment, her hand still resting on the bronze horse. Her eyes fixed on the now closed door. There was no anger in her face, only a deep, desolate sadness that seemed to age her in an instant. Mrs. Albright, on the other hand, seemed inflated with a sense of justification. "You see, sir," she repeated, turning to Arthur, who was emerging from the shadow of his study, "I told you she was scaring him. He needs order, not noise." Arthur walked slowly down the hall, his expensive shoes making no sound on the Persian rug. He didn't look at Agnes. His eyes, sharp and analytical, were fixed on Leo's door. He, the billionaire who could predict stock market fluctuations with terrifying accuracy, had just witnessed something that Agnes, in her rigidity, refused to see. That gesture with the hand had not been fear, it had been reaching. It was Leo's first attempt to touch the world beyond his walls. He stopped and finally turned to the housekeeper. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, the same one he used to seal billion-dollar deals. "Agnes, you have worked for this family for many years. Your loyalty has never been in question, but your methods in this matter are not producing the desired result." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "From now on, Miss Clara has full autonomy in her approach with my son. You will not interfere. You will not question, and you will no longer raise your voice in this wing of the house. Consider that a direct order." The housekeeper paled. It was a public reprimand, a humiliation that stung her pride more than any insult. She, who saw herself as the guardian of Leo's well-being, was being sidelined for a newcomer. Her lips tightened into a thin line, but she only nodded, a stiff, resentful dip of her head before turning and retreating, her spine erect in a display of her wounded dignity. The silence she left behind was charged with a new tension. Arthur then turned to Clara. "I saw what happened," he said, his voice a little softer. "Keep going." It wasn't praise, but it was permission. It was the transfer of a valuable asset, trust. Clara simply nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. The rest of the afternoon dragged on in an oppressive silence. Leo did not come out of his room again. Clara finished her work silently, the sound of her humming replaced by a thoughtful quiet. At the end of the day, Arthur was in his study, trying to focus on the cash flow of one of his companies, but his mind refused to cooperate. He thought of his vast net worth, a mountain of numbers that provided him comfort and security, but which proved utterly useless in fixing what was broken in his own home. He managed complex hedge funds, but he couldn't manage his own son's pain. It was then that he heard it, a low, deep sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth. A distant rumble that made the window panes vibrate subtly. Thunder. He stood up and went to the window. The sky, once a pale blue, was now stained with strokes of menacing grey. Another rumble, this time closer, louder. A chill ran down Arthur's spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with losing money or a failed deal. It was fear for his son. Thunderstorms were Leo's terror, triggering panic attacks that not even the strongest sedatives could quell. He looked toward the hall, toward Leo's closed door, and a feeling of impotence washed over him. Agnes's methods, with her loud music and attempts to drown out the sound, had always failed, and now, with Leo's fragile trust freshly shattered, he wondered, what could a young woman with a soft voice and gentle narrations do against the fury of the heavens? The next thunderclap exploded directly over the mansion, a titanic roar that shook the very structure of the house. Immediately, A sharp, desperate sound came from Leo's room, a wail of pure terror that cut through Arthur's heart. He ran into the hall, his paternal instinct overriding his momentary paralysis. From the other side of the house, he could hear the opening chords of a Mozart symphony, Mrs. Albright's predictable and ineffective solution to drown out the storm. The music, loud and grandiose, only added another layer of chaos to the boy's fear. When Arthur reached the door, he found it locked from the inside. He knocked softly. "Leo, son, it's me. Open the door." The only answer was another terrified sob. The sound of the rain now lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel, and the classical music competed with nature's fury, creating a maddening cacophony. Helpless, Arthur pressed his forehead against the cool wood, the weight of his fortune and power draining away before that closed door. That's when he sensed a presence beside him. It was Clara. She didn't look frightened by the storm, nor by the boy's panic. There was a resolute calm in her expression. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice low but clear enough to be heard over the tumult. "May I try?" He looked at her eyes that conveyed an empathy so genuine it was almost palpable. He had invested in dozens of specialists, spent a sum that could fund a small startup, all for nothing. What did he have to lose? He stepped away from the door, a gesture of permission. Clara didn't try to turn the knob. Instead, she sat on the floor, her back against the wall opposite Leo's door, hugging her knees. And then she began to speak, her voice no louder than a whisper, but with a timbre that seemed to cut through the noise. "I know the sound outside is big and scary," she began, speaking to the wooden door as if she could see right through it. "It sounds like an angry giant stomping his feet, but it's not." Arthur stood watching, fascinated by this utterly unconventional approach. Mrs. Albright appeared at the end of the hall, her face twisted into a scowl that said, "I told you so." Arthur held up a hand, a clear signal for her not to come any closer. "It's just the sky," Clara continued, her voice a gentle counterpoint to the symphony's crescendo and the wind's roar. "He's thirsty, and the clouds, which are like big, grey cotton pillows, are throwing a big party for the earth. The thunder is the party's drumbeat, and the rain, the rain is the lullaby, a song for the flowers, so they can drink water and not be thirsty. It's the sky singing to the grass, to the trees, a lullaby for the whole garden to fall asleep to." From the other side of the door, Leo's crying subsided, turning into shaky, scattered sobs. He was listening. Clara rose slowly and walked to the large window at the end of the hall. She opened it a crack, just enough for the cool air and the smell of wet earth to fill the space. The sound of the rain became sharper, more real. "Do you smell that?" she said, still speaking toward the door. "That's the smell of the earth drinking water. It's the smell of life. A happy, clean grass smell." There was a long silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain and the distant murmur of the retreating thunder. Then, an almost imperceptible sound, the click of the lock. The door opened slowly. Just a crack, one eye, red from crying, peeked through the opening. Arthur held his breath. Leo didn't look at his father, nor at the window. His focus was on Clara. Clara turned and smiled, a gentle smile that asked for nothing. She held out her hand, not to him, but toward the rain coming through the window. "Come," she said softly, "touch the lullaby. It's cool and it tickles." Leo hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, he emerged from the safety of his room and, his body still tense, walked hesitantly down the hall, one step at a time, toward the woman who, instead of trying to silence the storm, had given it a new story. Leo's small hand found Clara's, and together they touched the raindrops splashing on the windowsill. For Arthur, watching the scene, paralyzed, it was like witnessing a miracle. His son, who cowered at the slightest unexpected stimulus, was voluntarily touching the storm. He wasn't smiling, but the tension in his small shoulders had eased. His breathing, once ragged with panic, was now a little calmer, syncing with the gentle rhythm of the rain outside. He stood there for a long moment, his fingers exploring the cool dampness. His head tilted as if listening not just to the sound of the rain, but to the story Clara had woven around it. Mrs. Albright, still posted at the end of the hall, watched with an unreadable expression. It was no longer the open disapproval of before, but a baffled confusion, as if the foundations of her orderly world had been shaken. The Mozart symphony, forgotten, reached its grand finale, leaving behind a silence filled only by the natural sound of the calming storm. The housekeeper turned and disappeared without a word, the first tactical retreat in her silent battle of wills. In the days that followed, a new dynamic settled over the mansion. The tension between Clara and Mrs. Albright didn't disappear. It escalated into a cold war, fought in the small details of daily life. Mrs. Albright, feeling her authority undermined, began to exert her power in subtle ways. Clara's favorite cleaning products would vanish from the supply closet, only to be found on high, inaccessible shelves. Clara's work schedule was suddenly altered to coincide with Leo's rare naps or the moments when Arthur needed absolute silence for his conference calls about the cryptocurrency market, a clear attempt to sabotage the growing bond between her and the boy. Agnes also made a point of weaving dismissive comments within Arthur's earshot, lamenting the relaxation of standards and the lack of professionalism that now permeated the house. She saw Clara not just as a threat to her position, but as a risk to the very structure she had so painstakingly built over the years. Clara, however, seemed immune to these provocations. She navigated the small obstacles with unshakable patience, as if they were just another piece of furniture to be dusted, another corner to be cleaned. If she couldn't find the furniture polish, she'd use a homemade mixture of olive oil and lemon, explaining to Leo, who followed her like a silent shadow, how the scents were different and how the wood seemed to drink the natural blend more eagerly. If her schedule was changed, she adapted her narrations, describing the silence of the house, the distant sound of birds in the garden, the almost inaudible hum of the security systems. For every barrier Agnes erected, Clara built a bridge, using the very materials of the sabotage to create a new sensory experience for Leo. The house, once a labyrinth of loneliness, had transformed into a quiet battlefield, a struggle between rigid control and fluid empathy, between the old and the new. Arthur became an increasingly fascinated observer of this conflict. He, who managed a vast portfolio of assets and liabilities, who understood the importance of cutting one's losses, found himself unable to intervene. Firing Agnes would be simple, a logical business decision. She was loyal, but her methods had proven obsolete, a liability to his son's well-being. Yet she was part of the house's history, a link to the past, to Leo's mother and Clara. She was a high-risk investment with an unpredictable return, an anomaly in his calculated world. He found himself spending less time analyzing fund performance and more time listening to the sounds from the hallway. He heard Clara's voice describing the color of a rug as the red of a ripe apple, and saw Leo crouch down to feel its texture. He heard her tapping on different objects, a crystal vase, a wooden table, a plaster wall, teaching Leo to distinguish materials by the sounds they made. He was witnessing the construction of a new world for his son, a world he, with all his fortune and power, had never known how to offer. And in the midst of this silent war, a seed of admiration for the young cleaning woman began to sprout in his heart, an emotion as strange and unexpected as the smile that was beginning to appear, more and more often, on his son's lips. The end of the second week marked a subtle but significant shift in Leo's routine. He was no longer content to be a passive listener. The curiosity sparked by Clara's voice began to transform into active exploration. He started following the sounds she made through the house, his small hands gliding along the walls to guide himself, his bare feet learning to differentiate the cool marble of the hallway from the warmer wood of the library. Clara, sensing this transition, adapted her narrations. They became less of a description and more of an invitation. "I'm going to the kitchen now, Leo," she would say, her voice echoing softly down the hall. "The floor in there is made of cool, square tiles. If you tap it lightly with your foot, the sound is a hollow tock-tock. Want to hear?" And Leo, hesitant at first, would follow, his cautious little steps echoing hers, his hands outstretched, mapping the universe of his home through sound and texture. Arthur watched these expeditions from a distance. A pang of something he barely dared to name, perhaps it was envy, mingling with his relief. He, the father, the provider, the architect of a financial empire designed to give Leo the world, was a complete stranger in this new world unfolding within his own home. He didn't know the language of sounds and textures. His language was that of numbers, of compound interest, of cash flow. He knew the exact value of every piece of art hanging on the walls, but he didn't know how to describe the feel of the canvas or the smell of the oil paint. He saw his son opening up, blooming under someone else's care, and he felt like a man looking through a shop window at a party to which he hadn't been invited. The connection between him and Leo, already tenuous, seemed to be growing even more fragile, eclipsed by the bond the boy was forming with Clara. Mrs. Albright, for her part, interpreted this new phase as the final proof that the situation had spun out of control. To her, Leo's exploration was not a sign of progress, but of disorder. "He's going to hurt himself," she'd tell Arthur with grim urgency. "The house isn't safe for him to be wandering around like this. He's barefoot, touching everything. It's unhygienic. This girl is encouraging reckless behavior." Her attempts at sabotage intensified. One morning, she waxed the hallway floor with an extra slick polish, a veiled trap. But Clara, noticing the different sheen on the floor, turned the danger into a game. She got 2 polishing cloths, gave one to Leo, and showed him how to skate down the hallway, their laughter echoing through the once silent space. The housekeeper watched from the kitchen doorway, her face impassive, but her knuckles white as she gripped a dish towel. The rising tension between the 2 women was an undercurrent running through the house, and Arthur felt caught in a risky trade, unsure of which party to back. He saw the logic in Agnes's argument about safety and hygiene. They were the same principles that guided his conservative investments in treasury bonds and gold. They were safe, predictable. Clara, on the other hand, was like a volatile cryptocurrency, an investment in something new, radical, and with no guarantees, but the results, the emotional profits, were undeniable. Seeing Leo laugh, hearing his little feet slide across the floor instead of shuffling in fear, was a dividend none of his stocks could ever pay. On a sunny afternoon, Arthur decided to leave a meeting about his European expansion early. He felt an inexplicable urge to go home, an impulse that went against his usual work discipline. He entered through a side door, so as not to announce his arrival. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, not oppressive, but peaceful. He walked down the corridor, expecting to find Leo and Clara on one of their explorations, but they weren't there. The door to the grand entrance hall, usually kept closed, was ajar. A soft light spilled through the gap. Curious, he approached silently, pushing the door just enough to see inside, and what he saw made him stop. The air caught in his lungs, his heart pounding. It wasn't a scene of danger. It was nothing he could have predicted. It was something so shocking in its simplicity and beauty that his entire world, built on the cold logic of numbers, suddenly seemed obsolete and colorless. The air caught in Arthur's lungs, a gasp of disbelief that rooted him to the spot. Before him, the grand entrance hall, a space that was normally cavernous and solemn. reserved for impressing business partners who rarely visited, had been transformed. That hall, whose Italian marble floor he had personally selected as a symbol of his enduring wealth, was now covered in a patchwork of improbable textures. In the center, as if on a magical island, were Clara and Leo. Arthur's heart gave a painful lurch. Leo was barefoot. His small feet, which Arthur had always imagined as fragile and vulnerable, were courageously exploring the new terrain. There was a square of shaggy green carpet, like a patch of summer grass. Next to it, a dark, smooth slate tile, cool to the eye, then a sheet of coarse, brown sandpaper, and most surprising of all, a wide, shallow wooden basin filled with fine, pale sand. Clara was kneeling beside him, not touching him, but guiding him with her voice, which was a murmur of encouragement. "Now, step here, Leo. This is the sand. It feels like the floor at the beach. It's warm and soft, and if you wiggle your toes, it tickles." And then Arthur saw it. He saw the thing that made his perfectly constructed world of logic and capital shatter into a million pieces. Leo was smiling, not the ghost of a smile, not a hesitant twitch of the lips. It was a wide, luminous grin that radiated a joy so pure and uninhibited it lit up his entire face. He stepped into the sand, and a genuine laugh, a sound Arthur hadn't heard in so long he'd nearly forgotten it, bubbled up from his chest. It was the sound of happiness, the same sound that had once echoed through this house when his wife was still here, before the silence and darkness had settled in. In that instant, the revelation hit Arthur with the force of a market crash, wiping out years of certainty. He saw, with humiliating clarity, the magnitude of his own failure. He had poured a fortune into specialists, into the best therapists money could buy. They had all arrived with their clipboards and their theories focused on Leo's blindness as a disability to be managed, a problem to be worked around. They tried to fix his eyes, to force an adaptation to a world he couldn't see, and he, Arthur, the business genius, had endorsed that approach. He had treated his own son like an underperforming investment, an anomaly in his portfolio of successes. He had never stopped to think that the problem wasn't in Leo's eyes, but in everyone else's perception. The scene before him wasn't about the lack of sight. It was about the abundance of other senses. Clara wasn't fixing what was broken. She was teaching Leo to use the tools he'd always had. She was teaching him to see with his skin, with his feet, with his ears, with his soul. And in doing so, she was setting him free. The beauty of the moment was so intense it ached. He felt tears sting his own eyes, a betrayal of his steel-clad composure. There was his son, laughing, discovering the world in a way he had never imagined possible. And he, the powerful father, the billionaire, was just a spectator, a stranger looking in. He took an instinctive step forward, an overwhelming desire to join that island of joy, to feel the sand under his own feet, to share in that laughter. But before he could move, a rigid presence materialized beside him, and a voice, as cold as the marble beneath his feet, shattered the spell. "What is the meaning of this mess?" Mrs. Albright was standing there, her face a mask of contained fury, her eyes flashing with indignation. She didn't see discovery, she saw disorder. She didn't see joy, she saw a breach of all her sacred protocols. "This is a complete and utter outrage." Mrs. Albright's sharp, icy words fell upon the scene like a sudden frost, instantly killing the warmth that filled it. Leo's laughter died in his throat, a beautiful, fragile sound that broke apart in the air. His body, a moment before relaxed and exultant in the discovery of the sand, went rigid, and the luminous smile on his face was extinguished like a candle in a draught. Instinctively, he turned, fumbling in the space until he found Clara's arm. Clinging to her with the silent strength of returning panic, The world, which for a brief, glorious moment had been a playground of sensation, had once again become a place of sudden threats and angry voices. Clara reacted without hesitation. Her body became a shield, moving smoothly to place herself between Leo and the source of the hostility. She didn't look at Agnes. All her attention was on the boy, her hand covering his, her thumb making soothing circles on his back. "It's all right, Leo," she whispered, her voice an oasis of calm in the desert of tension. "It was just a noise. The sand is still here, warm and safe." Arthur felt a cold, precise fury rise in his spine. It was the same fury he felt when a promising deal was sabotaged by bureaucracy or incompetence. He had just witnessed the greatest return of his life, the pure joy of his son, and Agnes, with her blind devotion to meaningless rules, had tried to bankrupt him emotionally. His entire net worth, his investments in gold and equities, his assets spread across the globe, all of it was dust compared to the value of that laugh that had just been stolen. He stepped forward, out of the shadow of the doorway, his presence filling the hall with unquestionable authority. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Agnes," he said, and her name, spoken in that low, controlled tone, had the effect of a whip crack. The housekeeper turned to him, ready to unload her list of grievances, but the words died on her lips when she saw the expression on her employer's face. There was no hesitation there, none of the doubt she had hoped to exploit. There was only a decision, as hard and immutable as a platinum ingot. "What you call a mess," Arthur continued, walking slowly until he stood just a few feet from her, "I call progress. What you call an outrage, I call hope." He gestured toward Clara and Leo, who remained on their small island of textures. "For the last several years, I have brought the most expensive specialists, the most brilliant minds, into this house. I have invested capital you can barely imagine in an attempt to help my son, and every single one of them failed. This woman," he said, and for the first time, he looked directly at Clara, with an expression of respect that took her by surprise. "And in a few short weeks, with cloths and sand and a quiet voice, has achieved more than my entire fortune was ever able to buy." Humiliation was a poison that spread quickly across Mrs. Albright's face. To be overruled like this in front of the newcomer was an intolerable affront. "But, sir, the protocols, the safety, the hygiene. It is my duty to ensure the boy's well-being," she stammered, her indignation warring with his overwhelming authority. Arthur cut her off with a simple raise of his hand. "Your duty, from now on, is to no longer interfere. Miss Clara has my full and unrestricted permission to continue her work in any way she sees fit. Her narrations, her textures, her methods, they are now the protocol of this house. You will observe, and you will be silent. Is that clear?" The question was not an invitation for dialogue. It was the end of it. Mrs. Albright stood there, paralyzed for a moment, her face pale with rage and wounded pride. Then, without a word, she turned, her spine so straight it looked as if it might snap, and retreated from the hall. Her hard, resentful footsteps on the marble corridor echoed in the silence she left behind. Arthur watched her go, knowing he had won the battle. But the look she shot him as she left, a quick flash of animosity and defiance, made him realize the war for the soul of his house was far from over. Mrs. Albright's exit left a vacuum in the grand hall, a charged silence that seemed to absorb the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Arthur felt the weight of the moment. He had made a choice, a full emotional investment in Clara and her methods, and in doing so, had alienated Agnes's years of loyalty. In the business world, he knew that such bold moves could lead to extraordinary profits or catastrophic losses. He looked at his son. Leo was still clinging to Clara's arm, but the rigidity in his body was beginning to relax. He was tilting his head, listening to the echo of the housekeeper's footsteps fade away, as if measuring the distance of the retreating threat. "Clara," sensing the shift in the boy, gently freed her arm and touched the basin of sand. "The storm of voices has passed, Leo," she murmured. "The beach is calm again. The sand is still waiting for us." Arthur watched, amazed at how quickly Leo's confidence returned under Clara's influence. Slowly, the boy let go of her arm and knelt, his fingers dipping hesitantly back into the sand. The crisis was over. Arthur then turned to Clara, who was looking at him for the first time since he had entered the hall. There was gratitude in her eyes, but also a shadow of concern. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice little more than a whisper. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Arthur shook his head, a strange new feeling forming in his chest. It was admiration, pure and simple, for this woman whose wealth lay not in dollars or stocks, but in an empathy and wisdom that seemed infinite. "You didn't cause trouble, Clara. You brought a solution, one I was too blind to see." The word blind hung in the air for a moment, heavy with a new meaning. That evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was irrevocably altered. Mrs. Albright did not appear for dinner. She remained in her quarters, a silent, resentful presence on the upper floor. The other staff, sensing the shift in power, moved with extra caution, their gazes avoiding both Arthur and the hallway leading to the children's wing. The house seemed to be mourning the loss of its old order. Arthur sat at the head of the long dining table, the place across from him painfully empty. He felt more alone than ever. The victory over Agnes tasted bitter, as it only highlighted how dysfunctional his family life had become. He had the power to change the rules of his house, but he had no idea how to fill the emotional void within it. He thought of Clara. He thought of the way she had transformed a cold, imposing space into a world of wonder for his son. And he realized she wasn't just teaching Leo to see, she was teaching him to live, to trust, to feel joy. And in the process, she was unknowingly showing Arthur everything that was missing from his own life. His existence was a series of transactions, of risk-return analyses, of acquiring assets. He had amassed a fortune, but had forgotten how to accumulate moments. Leo's joy in the sand, the laugh he hadn't heard in years, was worth more than all the dividends in his portfolio. It was a form of wealth he didn't know how to obtain. Later, he was in his study, the blinking stock tickers ignored, when he heard a soft sound from the hall. It was Leo, walking alone, without Clara's presence. His steps were slow but not hesitant. His hands weren't outstretched for support, but swung lightly at his sides. He stopped in front of Arthur's study door. He stood there for a long moment, silent, just listening to the quiet hum of the computers. Arthur held his breath, his heart pounding. It was the first time Leo had come here on his own, slowly, as if testing unknown ground. Leo raised his hand and knocked gently on the door. 3 small taps, a sound that, to Arthur, was louder and more impactful than the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. The 3 soft knocks on the door echoed in the silence of Arthur's study with the force of a revelation. For an instant, he was paralyzed, unable to process the meaning of that simple gesture. Years of silence, of distance, of a one-way communication where he spoke, and Leo flinched, were suddenly condensed in that sound. It was a question, an approach, a bridge being built out of the darkness, from the direction he least expected. He stood, his expensive leather chair groaning softly, and walked to the door. His heart, a muscle trained for calm under the pressure of billion-dollar negotiations, was racing. He opened the door. Leo stood there, head raised in his father's direction, his face a blank canvas of expectation. There was no fear in his posture. There was a quiet curiosity, the same he displayed when Clara introduced him to a new texture or sound. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice hoarse, foreign to his own ears. He didn't know what to do, what to say. All his communication skills, so effective in boardrooms, had deserted him. He was a stranger to his own son. Leo didn't answer with words. Instead, he took a step forward, into the study. His small hands came up, not to shield himself, but to explore. They touched the fabric of Arthur's trousers, the fine, expensive wool, then traveled up, mapping, until they found his father's hand. Leo's fingers were hesitant but firm as they traced the outline of Arthur's hand. The gold watch on his wrist, the texture of his skin. For Leo, it was a discovery. For Arthur, it was absolution. It was the first time his son had touched him without fear of his own free will. In the days that followed, that knock on the door became a ritual. Leo would come to the study once or twice a day. He never spoke, but he explored the room with an intense focus. He touched the cool metal legs of the desk, the soft leather of Arthur's chair, the spines of the thick books on economics and investing. Arthur, in turn, learned to be silent, to let his son discover him on his own terms. He began to see his own world through Leo's senses. He'd never noticed how the hum of his computers created a constant vibration in the air, or how the afternoon sun warmed a specific spot on the rug, or how the old books had a dry, sweet smell. He was learning his son's language, a language that had nothing to do with asset performance or the state of the market. Clara watched these interactions from a distance with a quiet smile. She continued her work, turning the house into a sensory universe. But now, she subtly included Arthur in her narrations. "I'm taking these flowers to your father's study now," she'd tell Leo. "They're lilies, and they have a strong, sweet scent that will fill the whole room. Maybe he'll like that." It was a gentle way of connecting their two worlds, of including Arthur on the map she was drawing for Leo. Meanwhile, Mrs. Albright's presence had become ghostly. She performed her duties with a cold, robotic efficiency, her disapproval a palpable cloud that followed her everywhere. She did not speak to Clara and addressed Arthur only when strictly necessary, her words clipped and formal. The house was divided into two camps, and the tension, and though silent, was constant. One afternoon, Arthur was in his study when Leo came in, as was his custom, but this time he didn't begin exploring. He stood in the middle of the room, head tilted, listening. Arthur remained still, waiting. Then, Leo did something he had never done before. He spoke. The word was almost a whisper, but perfectly clear. "Dad." Arthur felt the word land in his chest. "Yes, Leo, I'm here." Leo took a step toward him, his hand outstretched. What is money?" he asked. The question, so simple and so impossibly complex, struck Arthur speechless. How could he explain the concept of capital, of profit, of net worth, to a boy who saw the world through touch and sound? How to describe the color of a dollar bill, or the shine of gold? His entire empire, his very identity, was contained in that word, and he had no idea how to translate it for the one person for whom it truly mattered. Leo's question hung in the air, simple and profound, dismantling the complex architecture of Arthur's world. Money. It was the foundation of everything he was, the engine of his ambition, the metric of his success. It was why this house existed, why specialists had come and gone, why Mrs. Albright had followed his orders. But how to explain the abstract to one who lived in the concrete? How to describe the concept of value to a boy whose treasure was the feel of sand between his toes or the echo of laughter in an empty hall? Arthur looked at his computer screen, where complex charts showed the flow of his capital, the rise and fall of stocks, the steady growth of his fortune. That was money, but it was not an answer Leo could understand. He knelt, bringing himself down to his son's level, a gesture that still felt new and slightly awkward. He took Leo's hand and guided it to his wallet, which lay on the desk. "Money is complicated, son," he began, his voice uncertain. He pulled a bill from his wallet. "This is a piece of it. It's paper. Feel." Leo ran his fingers over the bill, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's thin," he said, "and a little rough. It smells like a lot of hands." The description was so precise, so visceral. It caught Arthur by surprise. He had never thought of the smell of money that way. He then took out a coin. "And this is money too. It's metal, it's cold and heavy. If you tap it, it makes a sound." He tapped the coin on the desk, and the sharp, metallic ping echoed in the room. Leo tilted his head, listening. "It's a small sound," he observed. Arthur tried to continue. "We use these things, the paper and the metal, to trade for other things. Food, clothes, this house." But he could feel the inadequacy of his words. They were empty concepts, without texture, sound, or scent. It was then that Clara appeared in the doorway, holding a vase of fresh flowers. She stopped, sensing she had interrupted an important moment. "I'm sorry," she said, about to retreat. "No, Clara, please come in," Arthur said, feeling an immense relief at her presence. I'm trying to explain to Leo what money is." Clara placed the vase on a small table and came closer, her gaze shifting from father to son. She seemed to grasp the difficulty instantly. She knelt beside them. "Leo," she said in her calm voice, "you know your favorite blue blanket? The one that's so soft and warm?" Leo nodded. "Imagine that money is a way of saying thank you to the person who made your blanket," she continued. "The person who made the blanket uses that thank you to get wool to make more blankets or to get an apple to eat. And the person who grew the apple uses that thank you to get seeds to plant more apple trees. It's like a river of thank yous that flows from one person to another, helping everyone get the things they need and like." Arthur listened, mesmerized. She had transformed a complex economic concept into a metaphor of gratitude and human connection. She had given money a purpose beyond accumulation, something he, with all his degrees and his experience on the trading floor, had never been able to articulate. Leo seemed to ponder the explanation. He still held the coin in his hand. "So," he said slowly, "if I give this to you, it's a thank you." "Exactly," Clara said, smiling. Leo then turned to his father. He held out his hand with the coin. "Dad," he said with childish seriousness. "Thank you." A knot formed in Arthur's throat. He couldn't remember the last time someone had thanked him for anything other than a signed check or a closed deal. He closed his hand over the coin and his son's small fingers. The metal was warm from Leo's touch. In that moment, that single coin, an insignificant part of his vast net worth, became the most valuable asset he had ever owned. Across the room, a discreet sound caught his attention. Mrs. Albright was standing in the doorway, watching the scene. The expression on her face was not one of anger, but of a deep, desolate defeat, as if she were witnessing the end of a world she no longer understood and in which she no longer had a place. The coin in Arthur's hand seemed to weigh a ton, its symbolic value far outweighing its monetary one. Leo's "thank you" wasn't just a word. It was the closing of a chasm, the first installment of an emotional dividend Arthur hadn't even known he'd invested in. He looked over his son's head at the figure in the doorway. Mrs. Albright's face was a landscape of conflicting emotions. The rigidity of her posture was there, but a fissure had appeared in her armor of certainty. She wasn't looking at Arthur with defiance, nor at Clara with disdain. Her eyes were fixed on Leo, on the way the boy's hand still rested in his father's. There was a sadness in her gaze, the pain of someone realizing that love and loyalty, when expressed through rigid rules and control, can become a prison instead of a safe harbor. She had dedicated her life to protecting the boy from the world, but in doing so, she had built walls so high that even she could no longer cross them. That evening, the tension in the house reached its breaking point, not with an explosion, but with a heavy, decisive silence. The air was thick with the unsaid. Arthur was in his study, Leo's coin on his desk, glinting under the lamplight. He wasn't working. He was reflecting on the concept of wealth, on what it meant to be truly rich. He thought of his assets, his deals, the constant cash flow that fed his empire, and for the first time, he saw it all not as an end in itself, but as what Clara had described, a river he had dammed up for himself, building a fortress of solitude on its banks when he could have let it flow, connect, say thank you in ways that truly mattered. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It wasn't the light, exploratory tapping of Leo. It was two firm, formal knocks. "Come in," he said. Mrs. Albright entered. She was no longer wearing her impeccable housekeeper's uniform. She was in a simple traveling dress and held a small handbag. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, devoid of the anger and resentment of the past few days. There was a resigned calm about her. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice lacking its usual clipped tone, "I have come to say goodbye." Arthur leaned back in his chair, not entirely surprised, but still feeling the weight of the moment. "Agnes," he began, but he didn't know what to say. She cut him off, not rudely, but with a need to say what had to be said. "I have served this family for 20 years. I watched you build your fortune. I watched your wife bring light into this house, and I watched that light go out. I have loved Leo since the day he was born. Everything I did because I thought it was the best way to protect him." Her voice trembled for an instant, the first crack in her stoic facade. "But I was wrong. I was trying to keep him in a box of silence, thinking it would keep him safe. But that girl, she has given him the world, a world I couldn't see." She paused, swallowing hard. "This house no longer needs a warden. It needs a guide, and that is not me." She turned to leave, but Arthur called after her. "Agnes, wait." He stood and walked over to her. "I understand, and I am grateful for your years of service. Your legacy of loyalty to this family will not be forgotten." It was a formal farewell, but there was genuine respect in his voice. Agnes nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. Then, at the moment of highest tension, as the old order was about to give way to the new, a sound echoed from the hall. It was Leo's voice, clear and firm. He was standing in the doorway of the study, which Agnes had left open. He wasn't speaking to Arthur or to the housekeeper. He was speaking to the woman who had taught him to see. "Clara," he called. And then he said the two words that would seal the fate of everyone in that house, words that were at once a choice, a plea, and a declaration of love. "She stays." Leo's two words, "she stays," hung in the air, weighted with an innocent and unquestionable authority. It wasn't the command of a spoiled child, but the statement of a fundamental need, the affirmation of a heart that had found its true north. The sound of his voice, so rare and precious, acted as a final verdict. Mrs. Albright looked at the boy, and for the first time, Arthur saw a genuine, sad smile on her lips. It was a smile of surrender, of acceptance. She had lost her war, but deep down, she seemed to understand that Leo's victory was the only thing that truly mattered. She took a step toward him, hesitated for a moment, then just whispered, "Be happy, my boy." With that, she turned and walked down the hall. Her steps no longer those of a general in her barracks, but of a soldier leaving the field. The sound of the front door closing softly echoed through the house, the final chapter of an era. With Agnes's departure, a different kind of quiet settled over the mansion. It wasn't the oppressive silence of before, but a peaceful calm, like the clean air after a long storm. The last shadow of fear and rigidity seemed to have dissipated with her. Clara, who had come into the hall upon hearing Leo's voice, watched the scene, her eyes filled with an emotion Arthur couldn't quite decipher. She looked at Leo, then at Arthur, as if she understood that this moment was about much more than a housekeeper's departure. It was the dissolution of an old family and the potential for a new one to be born. Arthur felt a wave of gratitude so overwhelming it left him momentarily speechless. This woman, with her simple wisdom and generous heart, had reconfigured his entire universe. She had healed his son's loneliness, and in the process, she was healing his. In the days that followed, the house's transformation was complete. There were no longer forbidden corners or unspoken rules of silence. Leo's laughter became a constant soundtrack, echoing through the halls as he and Clara embarked on new sensory adventures. They made mud paintings in the garden, identifying the different textures of the soil. They cooked together, Clara narrating the smell of onions browning in the pan and the bubbling sound of tomato sauce. She taught Leo to recognize people by their footsteps, to distinguish the trees in the garden by the rustle of their leaves, and Arthur gradually began to join in. He abandoned the safety of his study for longer and longer periods. He sat on the kitchen floor, smelling the fresh basil Leo crushed between his fingers. He walked barefoot in the garden, discovering, like his son, the feeling of dew on the grass. He was learning to invest in a new kind of asset, time. Time with his son. Present time. The attraction he felt for Clara, born of admiration and gratitude, began to blossom into something deeper, more personal. He found himself watching her, not just as his son's savior, but as a woman whose strength lay in her kindness, whose intelligence was not in numbers, but in her understanding of the human soul. He loved the way her eyes smiled before her lips did, the soft sound of her humming as she worked, the infinite patience with which she unraveled the world for Leo. He, the man who had built an empire on transactions and net worth, was discovering a form of wealth that couldn't be quantified. It was the warmth of a hand in his, the sound of a shared laugh, the sight of his son running across the lawn, happy and free, guided by a string he himself had tied between two trees, creating his own safe path. The house was no longer a cold, silent mansion. It was becoming a home, and he knew, with a certainty that surpassed any market analysis, that Clara was the beating heart of that transformation. He knew he had to ask her to stay, not as an employee, but as something more. The only question was how. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, a spectacle of color that Arthur described to Leo as they sat together on the freshly mown lawn. The scent of damp earth and cut grass filled the air, a fragrance he had once barely noticed and now associated with freedom and joy. Leo, with his sharp mind and heightened other senses, absorbed every word, his small hands patting the ground, feeling the last vibrations of the day. He was no longer the boy hunched in fear. He was a fearless explorer, a keen observer, a young heart that had learned to see the world in a way most people with perfect vision never could. Clara was nearby, picking some flowers from the garden, her gentle humming mixing with the sounds of the approaching evening. Arthur took in the scene, his son, the garden that was now a stage for discovery, and the woman who had made it all possible. The decision was made, the certainty crystal clear in his heart. He had the world at his fingertips, fortune, capital, profitable investments, but the world he truly wanted was the one she had brought into his house and into his son's life. He stood and walked to Clara, who turned a serene smile on her lips as she saw him approach. "Clara," he said, his voice a little hoarse with emotion, but steady, I need to ask you something." She looked at him intently, her gentle eyes encouraging him to continue. He took one of the flowers she was holding, a simple daisy, with white petals and a yellow center. "I built this empire," he said, gesturing to the vastness of the property, "to give my son the world. But his world was made of darkness and fear. You, with your voice, your hands, your heart, you unmade that darkness. You taught my son to see with everything but his eyes. And in the process, you taught me to truly see him, not as a blind boy, but as who he really is, brave, happy, free." He paused, taking a deep breath. "This house," he continued, his voice becoming softer, more personal, "was a place of loneliness for both of us. You turned it into a home, and now I can't imagine this home without you." He held out his hand to her, the daisy between his fingers. "Clara, I know you are more than just an employee to us. You're the light that came back into our house. I'm asking you, stay, not to clean our house, but to help us build a home, to be part of our family, to be my partner on this journey of discovery." The air was still. Clara looked at the daisy in his hand, then at Arthur, and finally at Leo, who, as always, seemed to feel every nuance of the emotion in the air. There were tears in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. Her smile bloomed, as radiant as the rising sun. "Yes, Arthur," she whispered, and in her voice was the promise of a future. "I'll stay." At that moment, Leo, who had gotten up and come over to them, touched Arthur's hand, then Clara's, as if confirming the connection. He smiled, the wide, genuine smile Arthur now saw every day. The sight of this boy, once reclusive and terrified, now running freely in the garden, guided by his imagination and his heightened senses, was Arthur's true wealth. A cure for Leo's blindness had not arrived, but a cure for loneliness and fear had. Arthur no longer saw his son as a boy with a limitation, but as a boy with a unique and extraordinary way of experiencing life. He had learned that the greatest empires weren't built with money or power, but with love, empathy, and the courage to see beyond the obvious. He had invested in a future that couldn't be measured in stocks or dividends, but in laughter and connection, and the return was immeasurable. The house, at last, was filled with light, with life, and with a love that had found its way through the darkness.